welcome to our deep dive into the world of recreational drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know what you might be thinking.
Right.
Like, oh boy, here we go. Like,
Right.
I've heard it all.
Yeah.
But trust me, we're going way beyond just like the basics here.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the why behind the what.
Yeah.
The global tug of war over laws,
Right.
perceptions. We're even going to get into some of the economics.
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating topic.
Oh, it really is.
When you start to dig deeper,
Yeah.
it's amazing how this one topic sort of like unveiled so many different aspects of our world today.
It really does. For instance, get this, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime.
The UNODC?
Yeah.
Okay.
They reported that almost 300 million people use drugs globally in a single year.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people.
That's a big number.
And it really highlights the contrast, I think, between how widespread drug use is and the wildly different ways it's viewed around the world. But we're going to unpack that a little bit later in this deep dive.
For sure.
But for now, let's start with like a basic definition.
Okay.
When we say recreational drugs, what are we even talking about?
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So when we say recreational drugs, we're talking about substances that people use primarily for pleasure or leisure, not necessarily for medical reasons.
Gotcha.
So it's really about the experience that the person is seeking.
Okay, so that covers like a pretty broad spectrum then.
It does. It does. It covers a very broad spectrum. I mean, you think about cannabis, that's probably our most common example.
Sure.
Often brings about feelings of relaxation, euphoria. But then we're also talking about things like MDMA, which you might know better as ecstasy. Very popular at like music festivals and raves and things like that.
Right. And you can't talk about recreational drugs without talking about cocaine.
And cocaine.
Yeah.
And LSD.
Yeah.
And amphetamines.
Right.
Each one interacts with the brain and the body a little bit differently.
Sure.
Which kind of adds to the complexity of this whole conversation.
It's interesting how each drug seems to be linked to a certain image or subculture too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's kind of fascinating.
You know, like when you think about cannabis, you often think about maybe counterculture movements.
Yeah.
You know, groups advocating for personal liberty or challenging the norms. Yeah. And you think about MDMA, you can't deny the link between MDMA and the rave scene.
Right.
Where it's almost like a part of the experience.
Right. It's like part of the culture.
It really is.
It's really interesting. But we're going to get into how cultural contexts shape our views on drug use in a little bit.
For sure.
But for now, I want to talk about the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
When it comes to recreational drugs.
Okay.
And that's the health impact.
Right.
Because while a lot of people associate drugs solely with negative effects, it's a much more nuanced picture.
It is.
It's not black and white.
You're right.
Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, you know, it's very easy for people to simplify it and say drugs are bad, stay away from drugs. Right.
Don't do drugs.
Right.
But when we look at certain substances like cannabis, for example.
Well, even cannabis, right.
Yeah.
Like you were saying.
You know, people use that a lot of times recreationally just to relax.
To relax, to
feel good.
To feel good.
Or it's even used medically for some pain and different things like that.
Absolutely.
But when we look at the research, we see there are some downsides.
Right.
Especially with long-term use.
Especially with long-term use. And I would imagine for younger people.
Especially younger people.
Whose brains are still developing.
You're absolutely right. That can be associated with things like cognitive impairment.
Wow.
Memory issues.
Even with cannabis.
Which
a lot of people view as
a softer drug.
Right. It's still something to keep in mind.
It's still something to think about.
Absolutely.
And then you have substances like cocaine and amphetamines, where there's even more pronounced risks.
Absolutely. And you know what we see a lot of times is with those substances, there's a much higher risk of addiction. We see potential heart problems, a whole range of psychological impacts that can really be serious and really impact someone's life.
And those risks become even more alarming when you consider the amount of overdose deaths related to opioids and stimulants.
Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, they point to these substances as major contributors to the overdose crisis that we're seeing. And this is a big deal. This is a public health emergency in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
And it really underscores how important it is for us to really understand the potential harms associated with these substances.
Yeah, and not just writing them off.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It's like, oh yeah, they're bad for you.
Right. Because it's not always as simple as that.
Right. It's a tough reality to face For sure. And it really makes you realize that this conversation, it goes way beyond just like listing out a bunch of risks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it gets even more complicated
Right, it does.
when you factor in our culture.
It really does.
Our individual experiences, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how those shape how we view these substances.
Absolutely.
Like how we were talking earlier about how certain drugs are tied to certain subcultures.
Right. Like we were saying, you think about cannabis, you might think about counterculture. Right.
Maybe like advocating for personal liberty or even challenging societal norms.
Yeah. Like it's a form of self-expression almost.
Exactly.
Right. It's like saying, this is who I am, this is what I stand for.
Yeah, and that can even be part of the draw.
Totally.
Is the fact that it aligns with a certain group or certain ideology.
Right. Or it's a way to rebel against what's considered normal.
Absolutely. And you bring up a good point, too, because what's considered taboo in one culture might be completely acceptable in another.
Right. Like indigenous cultures who have used plants and fungi.
For centuries.
Yeah, for spiritual purposes.
Spiritual purposes, ceremonial purposes.
And now those same substances are regulated in other parts of the world.
Heavily regulated.
It's fascinating.
It really is. It's like this whole global tapestry when it comes to recreational drugs.
It is. It's a global conversation.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because this cultural clash, it really comes to a head when we look at the legality of it all.
Yeah, because you have places like Canada, Uruguay, where cannabis is totally legal.
Legal, regulated.
You're regulating it. They're taxing it.
Right. They're treating it more like we treat alcohol or tobacco.
Right. And their argument is this is a way to control it.
To control it.
Right. Make sure there's some quality control.
Right.
And it brings in tax revenue.
Revenue that can be used.
Which can then be used.
For really good things.
For good things.
Public health programs, education.
Right. And, I mean, in those countries, have we seen, like, a decrease in drug-related crime?
A lot of experts say yes. In fact, they're seeing a decrease in drug-related crime.
Wow.
Because you're taking that power away from the black market.
That makes sense.
But, of course, whenever we have this conversation about legalization, there are always concerns.
Of course, yeah. And one of the biggest ones is, what about the kids?
Especially young people.
Yeah.
Because, you start to think, well, if you legalize it, does that send the message that it's okay, that it's encouraged?
It's okay to do it.
And will that lead to more young people experimenting?
Right.
And that's a valid concern. However, research from the American Psychological Association suggests that legalization doesn't necessarily lead to a surge in drug use.
Interesting.
Particularly among young people.
So it's not as simple as if you legalize it, everyone's going to go out and start using.
Exactly. The key here is not just changing the law. It's creating a system that focuses on robust regulation, public education, harm reduction strategies.
So it's about acknowledging that people are doing this.
Yes. It's acknowledging the reality.
And how do we make it safer?
Exactly. How do we minimize the potential harm?
How do we protect people?
Absolutely.
Especially the vulnerable populations.
You got it.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Even if you don't personally condone recreational drug use, the economic potential is just massive.
Yeah, I was going to say, is this a money-making thing?
Oh, absolutely. ArcView Market Research, they're a leader when it comes to cannabis market research. They project that by 2025, the global legal cannabis market could be over $50 billion.
50 billion.
50 billion.
That's insane.
With a B.
Wow.
Yeah. That's a game changer.
That's a lot of money.
It is. It's a lot of money.
Makes you wonder if big tobacco's like eyeing that market, like, hey, maybe we should get in on that.
Right. Because that just highlights how big this conversation is.
Yeah, it really does.
It's not a small thing.
It's a huge deal.
It's huge. Yeah, it's a massive market.
It's only getting bigger, right?
Absolutely. And it makes you think like, wow,
yeah,
things are really changing.
Yeah.
What was once like this fringe issue is now a global conversation.
Yeah. When you were talking about how fast it's evolving, what were some of the things you found most surprising?
Well, this one study that came out of Johns Hopkins really caught my eye. They've been researching the potential therapeutic benefits of psilocybin.
Psilocybin? Now remind me what that is again.
Yeah, so psilocybin is that psychedelic compound that you find in certain mushrooms.
Yeah.
Magic mushrooms.
Right.
And for a long time, it was demonized.
Sure.
Totally taboo. Lumped in with all the other
recreational drugs.
Party drugs.
Yeah.
But
they're saying?
Now they're saying it could be the key to treating things like addiction, depression.
No way.
Even end-of-life anxiety.
Wow. So we're talking about something that was considered taboo, and now we're talking about it as something that could be healing.
Yeah. It really makes you think.
That is a huge shift.
Huge shift.
Wow.
And it just goes to show how much we still don't know.
Right. Like we're just scratching the surface.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It's pretty incredible.
It feels like we've covered so much.
We really have.
In this deep dive, Yeah. We've gone everywhere from why people use recreational drugs to the culture, the societal influences.
Yeah.
The legal stuff.
The laws, the economics of it all.
The risks.
The health risks.
Right. And like you were saying, it's constantly changing.
Always evolving.
So how do we even wrap our heads around it all? It's not easy.
It's not. And I think that's why it's so important to really engage with this topic thoughtfully.
Yeah.
To not make those black and white judgments because there are so many nuances. There's so many gray areas.
It's not black and white. I love that. That's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
It's about having an open mind.
Absolutely.
And really trying to understand all sides of this really complex issue.
All the factors at play.
Right. Well said.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to hear from you, the listener.
Yeah.
What really stuck with you today?
What surprised you?
Yeah. Did anything we talked about challenge how you thought about recreational drug use before? What questions are you still thinking about?
Yeah, keep exploring.
Because that's what this is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's about arming yourself with knowledge.
Giving you the information you need.
So you can make your own decisions.
To form your own conclusions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next episode.